The year was 31 BC. The Roman Republic had endured over a decade of on-again, off-again war since the assassination of Julius Caesar, and the two men now facing each other were coming to the end of a relationship that was almost as variable and as temperamental as the wars themselves had been. At stake was the future of what we now know as Europe, the Middle East, and the general Mediterranean basin. On the one path was a future of potentially diversified rule with many separate semi-independent kingdoms operating under one notional banner. On the other was a single unified state that would be embodied in a single glorified ruler. The battle that was about to commence was to set in motion the train of events that would dominate the next 1,000 years of European history, and which still profoundly affects the rest of the world today. The two commanders were Marcus Antonius, better known to us as Mark Antony, and the man who was actually known at this particular point in his life as Gaius Julius Caesar. Confusingly, but he's actually better known to us at this point in his life as Octavian. The guy did change names 3 or 4 times, as it turns out. In each case, the more commonly known name will be used as we go forward. In the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, the two men had initially, for a brief time, been at odds. Then they'd allied together against Caesar's assassins, then they'd fought a war against Pompey, and then they'd ruled the Republic for a while as part of a triumvirate, along with another general who, thankfully, was at least consistent with his naming, known as Marcus Lepidus. But, having managed to sideline him, Antony and Octavian had divided the Republic between them, with Antony ruling in the east and Octavian ruling in the west. A somewhat ironic prescient mirror of how the Roman Empire would later break up and fall. But tensions had been rising between the two, with each trying to undermine the other in public until Octavian hit upon political dynamite. Antony's love affair with Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt. In and of itself, this wasn't actually a massive issue to Rome as a whole. Various Roman consuls and more recently rulers had taken up with all sorts of foreign women without massively impinging on their public popularity. But the combination of deserting his Roman wife in favour of Cleopatra, who also happened to be Octavian's sister, his giving away of various Roman territories in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, formally moving his location to Alexandria, and then elevating the boy who was, to be fair, likely Caesar's actual biological, if illegitimate son with Cleopatra, Caesarion, to the position of the supposed true heir of Caesar, whereas Caesar's will had left most things to Octavian, plus a variety of other factors, meant that whilst Antony still retained a strong body of support in the Senate, his supporters were now in the minority. Octavian was thus able to use further political and forceful means to get the Senate to blame everything on the supposed wiles of Cleopatra, as it was much easier to get the Senate to agree to blame a foreigner than a Roman war hero, and then declare war on her. Octavian, of course, knew that Antony would come to her aid, thus usefully placing himself on the opposite side of things without Octavian ever having to actually publicly name him or formally move against him until Antony sided with Rome's enemies. Antony had a much longer military service history than Octavian, and was arguably of the two a much better general in a fair fight on land. He'd served with Caesar since the conquest of Gaul, and thus had also amassed a fair amount of personal loyalty amongst various Roman troops under his command. Albeit this was on the wane with various allegations that were coming out of Rome. Octavian, meanwhile, had the notional support of the Senate and the official status of Caesar's legal heir. And so he also had a large body of loyal troops who had been previously loyal to Caesar, even if Antony's troops were, on average, somewhat more experienced. Plus, of course, they each had their respective generals and followers who would add their own circumstances and expertise to the mix. The formal outbreak of war had taken place a year earlier, in 32 BC. Antony had assembled his army and a vast fleet put together from the Egyptian fleet of Cleopatra and the various vassal kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean, bearing in mind that the Egyptian fleet was built along Hellenized principles, as the Egyptian ruling classes had been extensively Hellenized following the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, and many of the other Eastern Mediterranean cultures also had extensive seagoing warfare experience. Plus, he also had the bulk of the capital ships of the pre-conflict Roman navy. This force sailed to attack Italy, but with large numbers of vulnerable transports, a combination of a blocking force assembled by Octavian and a severe storm caused them to divert and land on the western side of Greece, where Antony had quite a significant following, with the army taking up camp on the southern side of the entrance of the Ambracian Gulf at a place called Actium. Cassius Dio recounts in a typically Roman fashion how the outbreak of the war was perceived, at least how it was perceived after the account had gone through suitable editing by post-battle propagandists, and shows how much the Romans viewed this as a metaphysical struggle as much as a straight-up human one. He writes, "Such was the enthusiasm of the two sides, and such were their preparations. Meanwhile, many and diverse rumours were noised abroad by men, and many clear portents were shown by the gods. For example, an ape entered the temple of Ceres during a service and upset everything in it. An owl flew first into the Temple of Concord and then to practically all the other most holy temples, and finally, when it had been driven away from every other place, it settled upon the temple of the genus Populi, and it was not only not caught, but did not depart until late in the day. The chariot of Jupiter was demolished in the circus at Rome, and for many days a torch would rise over the sea towards Greece and dart up into the sky. Much damage was also caused by storm. Thus, a trophy which stood upon the Aventine fell, a statue of Victory fell from the back wall of the theatre, and the wooden bridge was utterly demolished. And many objects were destroyed by fire also, and moreover there was a huge flow of lava from Etna, which damaged cities and fields. Now, when the Romans saw and heard about these things, they recalled also the incident of the serpent, realizing that it too had given them a sign which bore upon the present situation. A little before this, it seems, a two-headed serpent, so huge that its length came to 85 feet, had suddenly appeared in Etruria, and after doing much damage had been killed by lightning. Now all these signs had significance for the whole people, for it was the Romans on whom would fall the brunt of the fighting on both sides alike, and it was fated that many perish in each army at this time, and that afterward all the survivors should belong to the victor. In the case of Antony, an omen of his defeat was given beforehand by the children in Rome, for although nobody suggested it, they formed two parties, of which one called itself the Antonians and the other the Caesarians, and they fought with each other for 2 days, when those who bore Antony's name were defeated. And his death was portended by what happened to a statue of him that stood on the Alban Mount beside that of Jupiter, for in spite of its being made of marble, it sent forth streams of blood. Owls, apes, storms, and massed city-sized brawls between children aside, Octavian now faced a more prosaic problem. The land battle could go either way, but whilst his own subordinates had a generally better grasp of naval warfare than the career land soldier Antony, especially Marcus Agrippa, who was an excellent admiral, his own fleet was made up of smaller, weaker vessels, and it was badly outnumbered. With the transport ships empty and his troops ashore, Antony's fleet might well simply turn around and run right over his own. However, the war now settled into a series of skirmishes and raids up and down the coast of Greece whilst winter passed by. This suited Octavian. His lines of supply were across the Ionian Sea back to Italy, or what we now call Italy, and were thus much shorter. And a combination of disease and falling morale seems to have been sapping the strength of Antony's forces, who were now somewhat scattered in winter quarters. Then 31 BC came around, and everyone started to reassemble. By the end of summer 31 BC, the Egyptian contingent, which made up a large portion of Antony's forces, was ready to go home. Staying another winter in Greece undergoing a long stalemate was out of the question in any case. This would remove the immediate threat to Octavian, and leave Antony with a rather large bill and nothing much to show for it, but it would also leave a stalemate that could go either way in later years. But both sides were also aware that Antony's retreat in such a manner would likely finish his prospects of ever taking Rome. Whether Antony planned to simply content himself with ruling the east, which seems somewhat unlikely at this point, or if he planned to force a fight there and then to decide the winner at sea, with potentially just enough time left to then cross the Ionian Sea if he won and march on Rome before the worst of winter set in, is something that historians have been arguing over pretty much since the first accounts of the battle were recorded. In any case, Octavian decided to try and use this opportunity to bring about a decisive action. But how to do so was another matter. At first, he favoured the idea of letting Antony's forces leave Greece in their ships, and then setting upon them whilst the transports were loaded and at sea. This might favour his fleet, which was made up mainly of fast and agile Liburnia, or biremes, smaller vessels that had 2 banks of oars. But it also attended significant risks. Each of Antony's larger quadraremes and quinqueremes had a couple of hundred troops aboard, which included an archer contingent, as well as numerous emplaced projectile launchers such as ballista and catapults, and fighting towers above the decks. If they played their cards right, the Antonian fleet could simply close ranks and present a bristling wall of firepower to any fast raiders, and then just outsail them in open water by virtue of their sheer size, ploughing through the waves rather than having to ride over them. Cassius Dio presents it thusly. After this, he formed a plan to let them slip by, intending to fall upon them in the rear as they fled, for he hoped on his own part that by swift sailing he should speedily capture Antony and Cleopatra, and expected that then, when they had made it clear that they were attempting to run away, he could, in consequence of their act, win over the rest without fighting. He was restrained, however, by Agrippa, who feared that they would be too slow for the fugitives, who were going to use sails, and he was also confident himself that he would conquer without difficulty, because in the meantime a violent rainstorm, accompanied by a mighty wind, had struck Antony's fleet, though not his own, and had thrown it utterly into confusion. Hence, he abandoned his plan, and following the plan of Antony, he put large numbers of infantry on board his ships also, and placed all his friends in auxiliary boats in order that they might quietly sail here and there, giving the necessary advice to men in action, and reporting to him what he ought to know, and then he waited for the enemy to sail out. And so, it seemed, everything would come down to a throw of the dice off the coast of Actium. But at this point, we run into one of the problems with many major ancient sea battles, and that is, no one can agree on who exactly had how many ships. Of the more detailed histories of the battle, Plutarch says that Antony had 500 ships to Octavian's 250, but this is also ostensibly what the two sides actually sailed to war with, not accounting for the losses to disease and desertion that would have made it harder for Antony to crew all of his ships, or the fact that some were transports. Florus, on the other hand, says Antony has 200 ships on the day against 400 for Octavian, completely inverting the odds. Orosius claims that there were 170 Antonian vessels against 230 of Octavian's fleet that were equipped with rams, along with another 30 non-ram equipped warships, and potentially a body of up to 100 to 150 triremes. So how do we resolve this? It has been suggested that a way to get approximate agreement, at least on numbers for Octavian, is to go with around 250 effective warships, with a reasonable number of smaller patrol craft, supply ships, and other non-frontline auxiliary units. This would then conflate the 250 ships mentioned in Plutarch with the 230 ram-beaked ships and the 30 non-beaked ships of Orosius, and then ascribe the 400 mentioned in Florus to simply being a collective report of everything he had that floated. And so we'll go with about 250 active warships on Octavian's side. Antony's forces, on the other hand, are far more difficult. There is no relatively easy reconciliation of the numbers. Even reports that some ships were burned on account of lack of crews are not universally supported in these main accounts. The only vaguely helpful path would be to suggest that the 170 to 200 strong figures cited are for ships that are actually under Antony's own command as warships. The 500 refers to the total fleet that was in their possession at the start of the campaign, and that the therefore missing approximately 300 vessels were made up of a combination of Egyptian vessels under Cleopatra's command, transports, and those that had been lost over the skirmishing of the previous year, where Marcus Agrippa had used Octavian's fleet to generally whittle down Antony's, as far as most of the engagements went. If the transports were thus left in harbour, and a force of Egyptian ships, which is usually cited at about 60, but some estimates run up as high as 100, formed a kind of backline reserve, then this might suggest an overall force under Antony's command that was somewhere in the region of the same size as Octavian's, but with maybe a handful more ships in reserve, and of course overall the vessels being larger. Again, as recounted by Cassius Dio, foreseeing that the size of Caesar's ships and the number of marines were chiefly responsible for the defeat of Sextus Pompey, that Caesar being Octavian, because as we said he was known as Caesar at this point in history, Antony had built his vessels much higher in the water than those of his opponents, constructing only a few triremes, but instead some ships with 4 and some with 10 banks of oars, and all the remainder in between these two. Upon these he had built lofty towers, and he had put aboard a large number of men who could thus fight from walls, as it were. So we'll assume that the two front lines were of about the same numerical strength for the purposes of this video. Of course, feel free to discuss or disagree with that in the comments below. Agrippa was in command of the northernmost ships of Octavian's fleet, the left flank. In the centre was Lucius Aruntius, and on the right was Octavian with Marcus Lurius. Antony and Lucius Gellius Poplicola commanded the Antonian fleet's right wing, opposite Agrippa. Marcus Octavius and Marcus Instesius commanded the centre, whilst Gaius Sosius commanded the left wing. Interestingly, Poplicola and Sosius were both former Roman consuls, the latter one of the very last consuls of the Roman Republic. Although, once again, exactly which commander was in which position varies according to the author. Some of them have Lucius Aruntius on the left-hand flank and Agrippa in overall command. And then there are arguments that perhaps one version of events tells where these commanders started out, and another tells where they primarily fought. As we'll see, things ended up getting quite messy quite quickly anyway. The disagreements between sources go on, not helped by a last-minute defection from Antony's side to Octavian, handing detailed information about Antony's plans to Octavian, and so the following account is thus my best effort to reconcile both the primary original narratives and modern scholarship into something resembling a coherent account that actually makes some degree of sense and doesn't have, the real-life equivalent of gaping plot holes in it. So, the Antonian fleet assembled in the morning just outside the Ambracian Gulf, anchoring its two ends close to the shore, likely indicative of a slight numerical inferiority in warships present on the front line. It seems likely that the role of the Egyptian rear line was to reinforce any part of the main line that might be weakened in combat. It took some hours for both sides to fully array their main warships, and during this time the lighter auxiliary craft of both sides sparred and retreated and returned again and again in between the two fleets, seeking intelligence, some break in the enemy lines, or just to draw out an ill-prepared squadron. But at some point just before noon, the fleets were finally ready, and the main action could begin. In some ways, the battle started with a watery version of the Battle of Hastings, which was still over 1,000 years in the future at this point, so perhaps Hastings started with a muddier version of Actium. But either way, Octavian's fleet made surges towards Antony's ships, but they couldn't afford to simply hit them head-on. The larger enemy vessels acting together would quite quickly chew them up. What they needed was to force the defending vessels to come forward and break up their formation. To the south, the fight seems to have been fairly even, with the towering Antonian ships keeping good formation and repelling assaults by the Liburniae, but equally unable to lock down and wipe out any large contingent of their smaller aggressors. In the centre, a similar but much closer struggle was going on, and the battle here began to break down into complete chaos. Formation lines collapsed, and the scrum began to pull in ships as massed missile and melee engagements broke out. A mixture of ramming to disable and ramming to board was used by both sides, but the clumping saved the Antonian centre from being completely overwhelmed, as an assailed ship could receive covering missile fire and potentially even reinforcements from another nearby vessel. During this time, the splintering of wood and the screams of dying and drowning men would have echoed across the waves, as the occasional massive quinquereme drifted out of formation and was then set upon by packs of smaller ships under Octavian's banner, overwhelmed en masse where no one Liburna could prevail, whilst perhaps 100 yards away a charging quadrireme might come barrelling through, bodily lifting and breaking a smaller vessel across its bow before ploughing headlong into a bireme and devastating its crew with ballista shots and arrows from on high. Ships denuded of most life above decks would then begin to serve largely as bridges from active vessels to targets found on the other side, whilst the rowers just hoped that nobody remembered they existed. Cassius Dio describes the fighting thus. So they engaged and began the conflict, each side indulging in a great deal of exhortation to its own men in order to call forth the skill and zeal of the fighters, and also hearing many orders shouted out to them from the men on shore. The struggle was not of a similar nature on the two sides, but Octavian's followers, having smaller and swifter ships, would dash forward and ram the enemy, being armoured on all sides to avoid receiving damage. If they sank a vessel, well and good. If not, they would back water before coming to grips, and would either ram the same vessels suddenly again, or would let these go and turn their attention to others. And having done some damage to these also, so far as they could in a brief time, they would proceed against others and then against still others, in order that their assault upon any vessel might be so far as possible unexpected. For since they dreaded the long-range missiles of the enemy no less than their fighting at close quarters, they wasted no time either in the approach or in the encounter, but running up suddenly so as to reach their object before the enemy's archers could get in their work, they would inflict injuries or else cause just enough disturbance to escape being held, and then would retire out of range. The enemy, on the other hand, tried to hit the approaching ships with dense showers of stones and arrows and to cast iron grapnels upon their assailants. And in case they could reach them, they got the better of it, but if they missed, their own boats would be pierced and would sink. Or else, in their endeavour to avoid this calamity, they would waste time and lay themselves more open to attack by other ships, for 2 or 3 ships would fall at one time upon the same ship, some doing all the damage they could, whilst the others took the brunt of the injuries. On the one side, the pilots and rowers endured the most hardship and fatigue, and on the other side, the marines. And the one side resembled cavalry, now making a charge and now retreating, since it was in their power to attack and back off at will, and the others were like heavily armed troops guarding against the approach of foes and trying their best to hold them. Consequently, each gained advantages over the other. The one party would run in upon the lines of oars projecting from the ships and shatter the blades, and the other party, fighting from the higher level, would sink them with stones and engines. On the other hand, there were also disadvantages to each side. The one party could do no damage to the enemy when it approached, and the other party, if in any case it failed to sink a vessel which it rammed, was hemmed in and no longer fought an equal contest. To the north, Agrippa played the engage-retreat card the best, drawing Antony's forces northwest and further extending his lines, thus detaching them from the coast. At some point in this, the larger Antonian ships seemed to have gotten up momentum, and, thinking perhaps that they had their enemy on the run, entered a full charge. However, this required more room for the oars to thrash freely, and the spreading formation of larger ships suddenly found themselves facing Agrippa's formation, which, instead of continuing to back away, was now coming straight back at them, and moving to flank. A holding action in the centre, whilst the wings began to pick off exposed vessels for wolf-pack-style overwhelming. Once the great Antonian ships were brought to a halt, even the numerous smaller auxiliary ships that were not rated for frontline combat became useful, ferrying in additional troops and helping to pull damaged or stuck Liburna free. Seeing the gap between their own centre and north formations extend and then open, Cleopatra's Egyptian forces moved up to reinforce the centre and plug this gap. This new momentum of heavy attack ships and their relatively fresh crews threatened to tip the balance in favour of the Antonians. If Octavian's centre failed, then the enemy ships could roll up his own southern forces from the flank with relatively few vessels of their own, whilst others accelerated to full attack speed and swept up Agrippa's exposed flanking forces before extricating the Antonian northern squadrons. At this point, at least according to some accounts, it seems that fires began to break out amongst the duelling ships, possibly accidentally, but more likely deliberately set. Probably the use of firebrands and firepots by Agrippa's forces to hasten the destruction of Antony's formation in order to allow him to countercharge the enemy countercharge and thus secure the centre. Fire would feature prominently in subsequent events. It is at this point that the battle seems to have turned. With the initial Egyptian strike's momentum fading and the melee in the centre now growing, it's likely that Cleopatra looked north and saw Antony's force enveloped, with smoke beginning to rise from some of the ships, and thus concluding that Antony and the northern part of the fleet was lost, the Egyptian queen looked to save herself. Gathering her relatively fresh vessels, she aimed another charge, this time at the gap between Octavian's centre and left, where the lines had grown thinner as ships were drawn either to the centre melee or to Agrippa's envelopment. In open water, with relatively few opposing ships, Cleopatra's formation of heavies managed to achieve a breakthrough and their own safety, whilst at the same time dooming any hope of her allies. Now, without the recently arrived support, the Antonian centre began to collapse, which influenced the struggle to the south, whilst to the north Antony would have seen the Egyptian forces make their breakout, and, realising what was now sure to happen, he rallied a core of his remaining ships and likewise used their sheer mass and coordinated firepower to effect a temporary rupture in Agrippa's formation, although likely shedding ships all the way as they were swarmed and brought down. This relatively small formation of survivors emerged north of the Egyptian positions, their combined strength numbering less than 30% of the starting strength of the frontline Antonian fleet, and they combined to head southeast for Egypt. Behind them, a combination of fire, combat, and surrender saw hundreds of ships falling into the hands of Octavian. The Antonian fleet was no more. The army ashore would likewise be forced to desert, retreat, or surrender. Dio recounts of this moment. When this, the Antony and Cleopatra retreat, took place, the rest of the soldiers became both discouraged and confused, and, wishing to make their own escape also in some way or another, they proceeded, some to raise their sails and others to throw the towers and the furnishings into the sea in order to lighten the vessels and make good their escape. While they were occupied in this way, their adversaries fell upon them. They had not pursued the fugitives because they themselves were without sails and were prepared only for a naval battle, and there were many to fight against each ship, both from afar and alongside. Therefore, on both sides alike, the conflict took on the greatest variety and was waged with the utmost bitterness. For Octavian's men damaged the lower parts of the ships all around, crushed the oars, snapped off the rudders, and, climbing on the decks, seized hold of some of the foe and pulled them down, pushed off others, and fought with yet others, since they were now equal to them in numbers. And Antony's men pushed their assailants back with boat hooks, cut them down with axes, hurled down upon them stones and heavy missiles made ready for just this purpose, drove back those who tried to climb up, and fought with those who came within reach. An eyewitness of what took place might have compared it, likening small things to great, to walled towns or else islands, many in number and close together, being besieged from the sea. Thus the one party strove to scale the boats, as they would the dry land or a fortress, and eagerly brought to bear all the implements that have to do with such an operation, and the others tried to repel them, devising every means that is commonly used in such a case. And now another kind of battle was entered upon. The assailants would approach their victims from many directions at once, shooting blazing missiles at them, hurl with their hands torches fastened to javelins, and with the aid of engines would throw from a distance pots full of charcoal and pitch. The defenders tried to ward these missiles off one by one, and when some of them got past them and caught the timbers, and at once started a great fire, as must be the case in a ship, they used first the drinking water which they carried on board and extinguished some of the conflagrations, and when that was gone they dipped up the sea water, and if they used great quantities of it at once, they would somehow stop the fire by main force. But if they were unable to do this everywhere, for the buckets they had were not numerous nor large in size, and in their confusion they brought them up half full, so that far from helping the situation at all, they only increased the flames, since salt water poured on a fire in small quantities makes it burn vigorously, at least according to the Romans. So when they found themselves getting the worst of it in this respect also, they heaped on the blaze their thick mantles and the corpses, and for a time these checked the fire, and it seemed to abate. But later, especially when the wind raged furiously, the flames flared up more than ever, fed by this very fuel. So long as only a part of the ship was on fire, men would stand by that part and leap into it, hewing away or scattering the timbers, and these detached timbers were hurled by some into the sea and by others against their opponents, in the hope that they too might possibly be injured by these missiles. Others would go to the still sound portion of their ship, and now more than ever would make use of their grappling irons and their long spears with the purpose of binding some hostile ship to theirs and crossing over to it, if possible, or if not, setting it on fire likewise. But when none of the enemy came near enough, since they were guarding against this very thing, and when the fire spread to the encircling walls and descended into the hold, the most terrible of fates came upon them. Some, and particularly the sailors, perished by the smoke before the flame so much as approached them, while others were roasted in the midst of it as though in ovens. Others were consumed in their armour when it became heated, and there were still others who, before they should suffer such a death, or when they were half burned, threw off their armour and were wounded by the shots which came from a distance, or again leaped into the sea and were drowned, or were struck by their opponents and sank, or were mangled by sea monsters. Those alone found a death that was tolerable, considering the sufferings which prevailed, who were killed by their fellows in return for the same service, or else killed themselves before any such fate could befall them, for they not only had no tortures to endure, but when dead had the burning ships for their funeral pyres. When Octavian's forces saw the situation, they at first refrained from approaching the enemy, since some of them were still able to defend themselves, but when the fire began to destroy the ships, and the men, far from being able to do any harm to the enemy, could not even help themselves any longer, they eagerly sailed up to them in the hope that they might possibly gain possession of the money, and they endeavoured to extinguish the fire which they themselves had caused. Consequently, many of these men also fell victim to the flames and to their own rapacity. Although it would be another year or so before the conflict finally ended as a whole, from this point on it would be a series of increasingly desperate defences, culminating in the deaths of both Antony and Cleopatra, and the establishment of Octavian as Augustus Caesar, first Emperor of Rome. The Roman Republic was dead, even if it hadn't quite realised it yet, and the Roman Empire had been born.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.